We're going to start off, I guess, at the beginning almost of your career, and I want to know what initially drew you into investigative journalism as a career.
I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, and we happened to live about a mile and a half from the restaurant where Jimmy Hoffa, the union leader, former president of the Teamsters, was last seen before he was kidnapped and ultimately disappeared, never to be found. And I was fascinated with it. I didn't even have a driver's license yet. I was probably 15 years old, so I used to ride my bicycle up because the crime scene was all there. There were FBI agents and local police and local reporters and network correspondents, and I became fascinated with the whole process, both the investigative process of the law enforcement and the reporting process. And I guess I sort of got bit by the bug right then. And when I went off to university at Michigan State, I, day one signed up for the news station and off I went.
To Catch a Predator became this sort of cultural phenomenon beyond the United States. So many people have told me that and I know from my own personal experience, so many people have told me how obsessed they are with watching it on YouTube, even still. Compilation videos. My husband just sits there watching compilation videos of it all day when he's working.
Tell him to subscribe to True Blue.
Yeah.
Watch the new ones.
But tell us how that sort of came about from your kind of early beginnings into doing that sort of sting show.
Well, we had done other stings. We had gone overseas to, for instance, India to do stories on child slave labor. We had gone to Cambodia to do undercover stories on child sex trafficking and tourism. So this was on our radar to do this sort of work. But in around 2004, I became aware of this online watchdog group called Perverted Justice. And I started talking to them, and my producer started talking to them. And I thought if we could use their ability to pose as kids online and combine it with our ability to wire a house with hidden cameras and microphones, it could be pretty compelling. And we had seen anecdotal stories about kids who had met adults online and, come to, horrible fates because of it. So I pitched the story, and it wasn't meant to be a series or its own entity. It was meant to be a segment on Dateline. And Dateline in those days was not a murder mystery procedural. It was a news magazine with a lot of different things on it, features, investigative stuff, and things like that. So they said, yeah, go do it. And we did it. And so I was driving out to the location in Long Island, New York, Bethpage, New York, and I started to daydream, caught in traffic, and I started to think, what if nobody shows up? What if I've just wasted tens of thousands of dollars of the network's money? And with that, my producer calls and says, we've got two guys scheduled to show up in 45 minutes. Where the hell are you? And so I got there, and before the next 2.5 days passed, 17 men had surfaced in that investigation, including a New York City firefighter. And I thought, holy hell, this is a big problem here. And so, it took a minute for us to digest it and figure out what we had, and we knew it was compelling. We knew it was something that had never been seen before in terms of television journalism. And that following fall, that was February or March of 2004, 20 years ago, this past March, and it aired, and people were just blown away by it. And so we decided to do it again in suburban Washington, D.C., and then we came to the realization that in order to be socially responsible, we had to collaborate with law enforcement.
Yeah.
Some of these guys were getting arrested after the fact, especially in Virginia, outside of D.C. But, we had to change the way we did business. And so we did, and we continued to work with law enforcement, and we do to this very day.
Yeah.
And I'll be out next week on another sting. I still get to question the guys. We still get to be immersed in the entire thing. We bring people, the viewers, inside the commission of this horrible felony. But when the decoys are actual members of law enforcement, it guarantees a successful prosecution in terms of the chain of custody of the transcripts, the chats, and all that. So it just makes it a more ironclad prosecution.
More solid. And I suppose with the later interactions of the show and Hansen versus Predator, and then again, most recently in Takedown, do people recognize who you are, or are you shocked when they don't?
That's a great question, because I am a little bit shocked when they don't. And a number of them don't know who I am and still wonder if I'm the mad dad who's walked in or the law enforcement officer, and they don't get it. They've not seen the show. More often than not, or at least half the time, guys will know. They may not let on right away, or they may not realize that it's me because my hair is grayer, or that it was 20 years ago when I started doing the investigations. But, we get guys walk in before I can even speak. They'll say, "Oh, you're Chris Hansen." And I'm about to talk to I watch your shows, and I've listened to your podcast. And I'm thinking to myself, what the hell are you doing here then? Has this not even sunk in for you that this is a horrible idea? I really wasn't. I'm not like those guys. I wasn't really going to do it. Well, of course you were,
And do you kind of hope that they do know, or do you think it kind of ruins the show when they straight away realize who you are, or is there kind of an allure to it?
It works both ways. Yeah. It's shocking to the viewer when somebody is familiar with the show, but they arrive anyway, and it has its own stunning impact when the person doesn't know who I am, and we play out the mystery of it during the questioning of the suspect. So I think it's equally as effective.
Yeah, both ways.
A tool to tell a very important story.
And obviously, like you were saying, you work with law enforcement now. Were there any of those earlier cases where you sort of learned a hard lesson about how this actually should work?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, you learn how to maintain, at least outwardly, a calmness and a focus that allows you to, keep your heart in your chest and not in your throat. This guy's walking in, and you really don't know who he is. We've done a little background. We don't really know if he's armed. We don't think he is. If they talk about being armed, we typically have the police take them down on the way in. I had armed security with me in those early investigations. But, things can spin sideways. And they never really have. I mean, there have been some tense moments, don't get me wrong. And the edginess of it, I think, is part of what makes it so compelling for people. I mean, it's you're out there without a net.
Yeah.
We make it absolutely as safe as it can possibly be, but that, inherent riskiness of it is part of what drives the popularity. There's just no way around it.
And how do you get into that mind frame, or, get yourself mentally kind of psyched up and emotionally psyched up to go in and kind of deal with these predators? Because I suppose at the beginning, were you nervous at all? Are you just so kind of, does it still affect you, or do you still feel yourself getting
You can't be brave unless you've experienced fear. You got to understand one to understand the other. And I'm always on point. I'm always very aware of the surroundings. I'll say take your hands out of your pockets, and, I don't want them fussing around in there. We don't know what he has in there, especially if we're in a state that has laws that allow people to carry concealed weapons without a license. We're extra aware. We had a situation in Alabama where the guy sets down a leather pouch on the counter. We do the entire interview. Big guy, he's up and down and anxious, but not threatening. And I finish. They put the cuffs on him to take him away. He says, "Oh, by the way, there's a gun in that leather pouch." So the entire time I'm talking to him, there was a loaded handgun in that pouch. Now, he wasn't threatening with it. He never touched it. He never pulled it out. But what would have happened if we weren't there and a teenage girl was there? And what if it didn't go his way and suddenly they're alone and he's got a loaded gun? It gives you pause.
The idea of a loaded handgun is such a foreign concept to somebody in Ireland, because they're just, they don't. Nobody has them.
No.
Not even the police, the Gardaí have them. Yeah. So do you kind of get used to that, kind of being alert and ready to?
Yeah, we've worked through scenarios.
Yeah.
What if?
Yeah.
Because if you think it through, then in my mind, it's likely not to happen. It's the thing you don't prepare for that's going to catch you off guard, and it's going to be disastrous. So, we're prepared for it. And I never take it lightly. I never go in there thinking, oh, this is just going to be another regular run of the mill, because they never are. Each one is different. And in terms of mental preparation, you got to be rested. You got to be fit. You're on your feet for a long time. You have to be mentally focused. And when you get the transcripts, you have to go through them very quickly. And you may take notes for a half hour on a guy's conversation, and the guy never shows up.
Yeah.
But you have to keep them because he may show up instead of the third guy that you're expecting. So you never really know. And the lesson here is, if you're going to be a good interviewer, and especially in this situation, you have to be a good listener.
Yeah.
So anybody can jump out of the bushes and create 10 seconds of dramatic video and scare somebody off. My job is to get them sit down, disarm them, tell me why they're here, whether it's the cockamamie BS story that, they often give, or whether sometimes they experience a catharsis and they lay it all out there. And they explain what happened. And if they've done it before, they'll tell me. And I think that's very instructional to people, because if you understand how a predator's mind works, you can better understand how to prevent people from being the victim of a predator. So, it's all about getting into their heads and understanding it.
So you obviously have this role where you're doing this, you have the years and years of experience, you've got this whole team behind you, you're working with law enforcement, but there's also a lot of vigilante groups.
Yes.
Definitely, I've seen it happen in Ireland, I've seen it happen in the UK, sure. I assume it happens here in the US. Does. What are your thoughts on them? Do you think that they have a right to operate, or do you think that they should be a bit more careful about how they do?
I think there's a very important role in our society for citizen journalists. I think we've seen a lot of great work come through podcasts. A lot of crimes have been solved through citizen participation, crowdsourcing information, and I think it's important. And I do think that the democratization of our airwaves in terms of social media and YouTube has been generally a very positive thing. It is given a voice to a lot of people who deserve a voice. But it also gives every jerk and every clown and every person who wants to exploit the situation for profit and just attention, it gives them a platform. And so there have been some very bad people exposed by these vigilante or amateur predators. I cringe when I see some of them. There are a handful who find these people and turn it over to law enforcement, and they make good arrests. Yeah. There are others who are shooting smoke cannons at these guys and embarrassing them and threatening them and committing crimes themselves to expose somebody who by all rights is a bad guy who should be exposed, but they've tainted the case to the point where there can never be a prosecution. Had they given the information to law enforcement, or worked as I do with law enforcement, which they can't because they don't have the trust, law enforcement could get warrants, they could confiscate computers and phones, and they could get forensic information that may lead to the solution of other crimes. And once one of the bad vigilante predators does this, the case is ruined. They'll never be able to prosecute it. And
that's the big issue, I suppose, with them is...
So this guy who did bad stuff, he's got a 20-minute YouTube video that's embarrassing, but that's the end of the story.
Yeah, there's no real justice there. Yeah. So over the years, have you seen any, I suppose, significant changes in the methods or the tactics that are used by online predators?
Absolutely. When we started, we merely had decoys in chat rooms on AOL and Yahoo, maybe MySpace. And today, the number of platforms upon which adults can approach children has literally exploded. And so while it's harder to catch them, it used to be they're all in 3 places. Yeah. And so we'd do a sting and we'd get 24, 28 guys. One sting, we had 51 guys show up.
Wow.
I mean, in 3 days.
Yeah.
And now we see 6, 7, 8, but that's successful because we got 6, 7, 8 guys off the streets with successful prosecutions. But they're harder to find now.
Yeah.
They're trickier. They've gotten hipper. And everything that starts on a social media platform quickly goes to texting. And that becomes more difficult depending on the app they're using to track and follow. So we've had to get more crafty, and law enforcement had to get more inventive to track the crime.
How have they adapted?
Well, I think they have new technology now. They have, a better understanding of how these guys are working on social media. I think they have some partners in the social media world who are helpful. And I think people are more hip to reporting it. And I think law enforcement is more apt to pick up an investigation where 10, 15, 20 years ago, there wasn't the understanding of how to investigate a crime like this. And that, quite honestly, has been the problem with sextortion. And that's why we're doing such a big detailed investigative documentary on it, because a lot of these cases came in as run-of-the-mill suicides, and a sad day, 16, 17-year-old killed themselves. But why? And then they get to the next level. These guys from Nigeria, the scam artists, were pretending to be girls, and they coaxed them in and blackmailed them, and they couldn't see their way out, and they killed themselves. So now the FBI is going to Nigeria, and they're locating these suspects. They're extraditing them back to the U.S., and they're facing prosecution. So, they're getting smarter and bolder, and they have budgets to go do it.
And that's a big thing, I suppose. Does it have to go as far as them arriving at a meetup, at a sting? Or is there an ability to, I suppose, have them on Snapchat? And I think for me, I am just baffled by how parents let their kids on Snapchat, because I've heard such horror stories.
Yeah. Well, the solicitation, which is the root of the crime, takes place online. So in most states, most of the time, the crime is committed online. And that's why these cases are so successfully prosecuted. I mean, we're at a 99, 98% success rate with prosecutions. I mean, the people take the plea deal because they know they're sunk because of the chats. The chats are the chats. And if there's no question about the chain of custody, which there is not, because it's all in the hands of law enforcement, they can subpoena my interview with the guy, fine. It is what it is. It's not going to help you.
Yeah.
It's probably going to hurt you. But you can have it, and you can raise all kinds of issues. It's not entrapment. The guy made the first move. It's very standardized. The guy has to make the first move, has to reach out to the underage person, or the decoy posing as the underage boy or girl. And then they have to initiate the talk of sex. And so it's a very clean case. There's no entrapment. And in many cases, these guys can be arrested and prosecuted even if they don't show up. In fact, in a lot of jurisdictions, they'll do the sting for a week's time. And then a few days later, they'll figure out, okay, who broke the threshold of committing a crime here? And they make a list and they go pick them all up. They get charged too.
And speaking of the new ways that they're able to, connect with kids, be it on Snapchat, I think Kik is a huge thing as well.
It's huge.
It's not as big in Ireland, but it's definitely something
big here.
That's an issue.
It comes and goes. You will see a big wave of Kik-related cases in the media, and then it'll die down and they'll use something else. But I mean, we've seen horrendous cases on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I mean, these are run-of-the-mill, easily accessible, everyday platforms. This isn't something that takes place on the dark web.
Yeah, that's, I suppose,
one of the most
important things.
But these kids aren't on the dark web.
No.
They're on, they're on Instagram, and the predators know that.
And are they using Telegram? Is that
I can't remember a case that we've done with Telegram, but I mean, I have to believe it's been used. Why wouldn't they?
Yeah. Is it popular amongst kids, or is it more?
Telegram, as far as I know, and I'm not an expert at that, but as far as I know, Telegram is used by adults, especially those who communicate overseas, to save on the cell phone bill.
Yeah.
And it's also a safe place for people to post their political views without being censored by somebody at Facebook or X or...
Yeah. I would assume that that's how it's mostly used, because that's, again, how it's mostly used in Ireland. It's not really kids, it is people who are using it for political reasons. But what would you say are your biggest concerns, personally, about how the internet has evolved over the years?
Well, I think there are ways that the internet service providers, the internet companies, could monitor more closely communications to detect predatory activity. And I think what you see is a cycle in Congress here in the United States, where all the major players are marched in and they say, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. We're going to make changes and it's going to get better. And then 6 or 8 months later, you see a trade group saying, well, we don't want to really step on the First Amendment or rights of users, and it gets watered down and it goes through a cycle. And it's unfortunate because I think that sometimes they're afraid to push too hard on the internet service providers, because right now we have a voluntary reporting system where when they do detect inappropriate material being transferred to a child or inappropriate pictures or conversations, they are reporting it voluntarily to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which does a marvelous job of sorting this all out and referring these cases. But I think there's a fear that if they push too hard and they go to encryption, for instance, then the whole deal is lost. Then we're back to square one. And so there's a balancing act that politicians and executives in that world are trying to be a part of right now.
So on the flip side of that, so obviously, with the service providers that you're talking about, what is your best advice that you would have, I guess, for parents of kids nowadays?
Well, I think it starts with a conversation between you and your child the moment they get on the internet, the moment they have access to the internet. And you have to explain it in a way that a child can digest. And it starts with a very simple conversation. There are grown-ups on the internet who like to trick children.
Yeah.
Children do not like to be tricked. And then as that child matures and has greater access to the internet, you need to ramp up this conversation. And I think part of it needs to be what we went through in this country 20 years ago with drinking and driving, or smoking pot and driving, which is, I don't want you doing that. I'm not crazy about you drinking anyway. But if you're in a situation where your designated driver has a drink, I'll come and get you, or I'll send a car to bring you. And we won't yell that night. We won't have an argument. We'll discuss it calmly the next day. And I see all these cases. I sat on stage yesterday with parents of 2 children who were tricked by internet scammers from Nigeria, who were so embarrassed, and because of their age and adolescence, couldn't see their way out of it, that they killed themselves. Good students, creative students, handsome students, kids who were headed off to college, dead, because they couldn't see their way through 2 weeks of potential embarrassment. And the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has tips and ways for you to scrub this stuff off the internet. Like your grandma's going to care if you showed yourself in a naughty picture on Facebook. Grandma's not going to see it. Your parents are going to get over it. It's done in 2 weeks. But they can't see their way through it. So somehow you got to reach that kid and say, look, knucklehead, I don't think you're stupid enough to do this. But I understand how little young men think. And it's out there, and if it happens, God, don't be afraid to talk to me about it.
Yeah, so it's not a case of ban them from the internet, don't let them have phones.
You can't, because they're going to find the internet. They're going to go to Starbucks. They're going to go to their friend's house. It's like when I told my older kids they couldn't have Grand Theft Auto. Well, they're over at the neighbor's house where the kids are 2 years each older than them playing Grand Theft Auto. And it was a year before I knew. I mean, so what lesson did that teach?
So you got to have that conversation.
Go to your friend's house. And, So you got to teach them.
And what do you think, I suppose, needs to be done to protect vulnerable people from predators online? So if kids are going online, they've had that conversation with their parents have said, okay, I'm giving you a phone, talk to me if it happens, but what would you say to those to help prevent that?
I think you can monitor.
In the first place?
I think you can monitor phones, and I think you have to remind children that it's actually not your phone; it's my phone that I have given to you to use. And there's nothing wrong with putting safeguards on the phone or monitoring devices, or dumping the phone, tossing the phone. That's your phone. When they get old enough to buy their own phone, then that's a different conversation. But until then, that's a parent's phone.
So your biggest concern, and like you said, you have this documentary coming up on sextortion, your biggest concern would be that these kids aren't able to come forward and tell their parents. But can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing, what the documentary is about? Well,
the documentary focuses on 4 different young men who took their own lives. And how shocking it is to me as a journalist who's been in this world for 42 years that this is going on at the extent it is, and that we've not been able to bring as many of these killers to justice. I mean, these people are able to go through the internet from Lagos, Nigeria, and enter a home in pristine Marquette, Michigan, and commit murder. That's what this is. It's murder. And they're ruthless. And they're out for money, and that's it. They don't give a rat's ass who gets hurt or gets killed in the process. And it's devastating families. And when I started to realize the extent to which this was a problem, and we did the first interview with the parents, and when we do these interviews, and we go live with the parents for a day, you see the room where the young man lived. Sometimes you see the bathroom where he killed himself. And you live with that father and the mother, and you have to talk to them not just as a journalist, but as a parent. And it rips your heart out. And if my heart is ripped out, then you can only imagine the impact this has had on the real parents. And so what do you do for these people? You expose it, you give them a voice, and you educate and create awareness and a dialogue that maybe didn't exist before. And that's what we did with the Predator investigations. It's what we continue to do with the Predator investigations, the takedown version. And it's what we do with these documentaries.
And is the documentary focusing on the family and what's happening there, or are you doing sting operations as part of that?
We're not doing stings.
Right.
We're not doing stings. We will do stings.
That's a separate sort of...
That's a separate sort of thing. But in this documentary, we take you inside these 4 cases. And I can tell you that, for instance, in the case in San Jose, California, when we were sitting at the police department there, interviewing the mother of this child who took his life, and the detectives that worked the case, while we were there, 4 cases of sextortion were reported in that day. Not suicides, but just cases of reported sextortion, while we were sitting in the San Jose Police Department.
So if you're a victim of sextortion, what would your advice be to the parents or even the kids themselves?
Save everything. Call your local law enforcement. Encourage them to team up with federal law enforcement to track it down. But save everything. Stop communicating. And don't send them any more money. Because
this, I suppose, I'm framing it as this is happening to kids, but it's happening to adults as well.
Oh, yeah? It does. It does happen to adults, and it's sextortion. It's the same thing. But there was a story the other day in the New York Times of a 33-year-old pharmacist got duped into the same thing. And it's like, on the one level, you want to say, God, you should know better at 33, but people want to believe what they want to believe, and they get all jazzed up, and it's the fantasy world. People ask what drives these predators. Well, it's not that different from a heroin addict. A heroin addict knows there's a 20% chance there's fentanyl in the heroin. Well, the predator knows there's a 20% chance it's Chris Hansen or some law enforcement group. They really do. Yeah. But they're the addiction and the need to fulfill this fantasy takes over, and they risk that 20%. And 20% of the time they come face to face with me. Or in the case of fentanyl, they're dead. Yeah.
And do they tell you why they do it? Like why? Because there's been people that you've stoned twice.
Yeah.
Multiple times. Do they tell you why they keep doing it? And what is that reason?
They can't control the fantasy of it.
It's addiction.
They try to, it is addiction. But it's, the adult has a responsibility to handle their addiction and not to harm a child. And they'll have 100 different excuses about, well, she asked me to come over. Well, you can't ask somebody to come over when you're not of age.
Yeah.
Well, I thought she was just role playing. Well, that's not what they said.
Yeah.
And they make it very clear, abundantly clear, that this is somebody who's underage.
It's brilliant. I love when you take your receipts out and you're like, actually, let me go through the notes here.
Let me go through this, right, and you take, copious notes on these things. And, sometimes we get the printouts if there's enough time, but there was so much of it in the early days that was all chat-based because all the chat took place on the platform. Now it's a very limited chat on the platform and it goes to text. So sometimes it's I'm having to take the notes down very quickly and then turn it around and make sure I can read my own writing. And I talk to the right guy whose notes I have in front of me.
And let's talk about, I suppose, something a bit more lighthearted.
Sure.
Because we've been through a lot here. But I suppose it's something that we spoke about when you immediately arrived and I had to say to you, take a seat. Does that come back to bite you a lot? Do people...
It's fine. It's on T-shirts and we have T-shirts with it on. And this phrase began with me trying to just get control of the situation. And the kitchen counter is a bit of a way of providing a safety barricade for me. Now, it doesn't always go down that way, and sometimes we're face-to-face and toe-to-toe or, sitting in chairs just like this. But in the early days of trying to figure out, the most controlled way to do it, have a seat right over there, was to get control of the situation. And now it's become this, buzzword that's been parodied on everything from The Simpsons to South Park to, things I probably even haven't seen yet, But, but none of that. Look, when I came up with the idea to do it, I had no idea it was going to become a part of the fabric of pop culture. And it has. And so I've used that to have access and to have the ability to tell a lot of important, compelling stories. And I can get to places, where a lot of other journalists can't get. And I have access that other journalists don't have because I've developed this trust of law enforcement. And it is a great way of telling stories in a very enterprising way where you take viewers inside the commission of a crime. They're watching this take place in real time. Yeah, because I suppose a lot of true crime, it's after the fact. You're telling the story later. Yeah. It's recreations. And that's all very good. And it makes for compelling television and film. But what we do is very much in the moment.
And do you think that's what's made it so successful?
I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
I think it's a combination of things. It's that immersive ability to take people on the journey of discovery inside the commission of a crime. It's whatever personality I bring to it, which can range from earnest and understanding to, I'm not taking any more shit from you, really, buddy, who are you talking to here? And don't get snotty with me because I'll give it right back to you.
Yeah.
And I think it's the fact that it's a little edgy, and I think there's a very dark, humorous part of it too. And there is, and you have to tip your hat to it. I mean, some of it's just really darkly funny. We had a guy a couple weeks ago in Alabama, finished the entire interview. The guy was in court on another case when he was texting this girl. Shows up, finished the entire interview, and he says, well, I probably couldn't have done anything anyway. I said, what? He said, I probably couldn't have done anything anyway. I said, what do you mean? He goes, I shot myself in the penis. I said, you what? No, we're rolling on this whole thing. And he goes on to the whole story how he was cleaning his gun and shot himself in the privates. And he wasn't sure if he could perform with the girl.
Right.
As if that was some kind of an excuse. And I'm looking at the camera guys, and they're one eye out of the viewfinder. It's like, oh my God,
So he did it mistakenly. When you said that, my mind went to, he's done that so he knows that he has this perversion, but wants to stop himself. But no, it wasn't. That's an honest, take on it. But that's not. At least that's not what he said. He offered to show us, and I declined politely. Well, Chris Hansen, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was lovely.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.